and then to provide a lower, so that sort of provides a general sort of what should be seen as a midpoint. And then as for a lower base, I analyzed child fatalities. And this is the point I was talking about earlier, about where we start to see Palestinians from after about the age of 8 seemingly engaging in the conflict. You will notice for up to the age of 8, there tends to be a random distribution by sex. Once you get past the age of 8, the divergence between boys and girls markedly increases until the age of 17, where I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's obviously, as you can tell by the graph, a significant divergence. So to me, this indicates that Palestinian boys are engaging in the conflict from approximately the age of 8, where it's onwards increasing numbers. So if we make the assumption, because this is what we have demographic data for, that every fatality under the age of 10 was a non-combatant, so therefore controlling for any sort of inflationary effect, because it's very hard for people under the age of 10 to be combatants, where, however, there will be a considerable deflationary effect because children are much less likely to be in locales of operations. You get a percentage of 7%, but of course, because we notice boys are also engaging from about the age of 8, if you just use girls, all the numbers here become fuzzy because there are so few, and drops a little less to 6.6. But in both cases, it's approximately 7%. And that should sort of seem to be the lower limit. So basically, I'm positing that the range, any sort of reasonable determination of Palestinian civilian fatalities should be in the range of 7 to 50%, and with a likely midpoint in the teens. And as a simple, at the time I was doing this, now, the margin of error on this is huge. Because there are only 3 fatalities under 10, so it's not really that statistically valid. But as a simple example, I applied sort of my approach to the assault on Gaza. There are 119 fatalities in the database from Gaza from February 27th to March 3rd. And when I plug these numbers into my form of analysis, it falls within the range that I'm talking about of 7 to 15%. Anyway, so in response to my form of analysis, this was from Bethlehem's review, and they referred to my groundless conclusions and noted that there are various ways to explain these anomalies. First, that there are very few women on the streets, and civilian bystanders killed in targeted killings on a busy street, for example, are invariably men. Well, first off, that's rather hyper-orientalization of Palestinian society. The Palestinian society is not Afghanistan under the Taliban. It's significantly more liberal than that, and there are significant numbers of women on the streets. And particularly, the section in yellow is particularly poignant because, of course, not only are women not only are the civilian bystanders killed in targeted killings not invariably men, but there's a significant portion of women. They maintain in their database civilian entries for civilian bystanders for targeted killings. There are 154 in total, of which 36 are female. And what is most interesting is when you map the data, you get an exceedingly high, the highest correlation of any of the data that I used between women and children for civilian bystanders of targeted killing and the overall population. In many ways, this criticism, was something I added to my paper, which was brilliant because I didn't think of it myself originally, really sort of illustrates the effectiveness of this analysis. But of course, you see with Bethlehem's categorizations of males, there tends to be that same 15 to 35-year-old bump. That for some reason that males in that age tend to be dying as civilian bystanders according to them in higher degrees, which I would posit are probably not civilian bystanders. That scale is 1 to, shoot, that got cut off. I think it's 1 to, I'd have to check my graphs, but it's in the paper. Anyway, so the other point that I was making is there is significant validity to the argument that women aren't nearly as present there is some validity to the argument that women aren't present on the streets, and so various ways to understand and compensate for this. And I've tried various ways to map the data, and with a 1 to 10,000 scale, you get a really high correlation between the ages of under 30, and with a 1 to 4,000 scale, you get a high correlation between the ages of over 35. And so as a sort of perhaps a way to posit it, to make the argument, I mean, again, this is entirely subjective, but make the argument, okay, yes, women aren't nearly present in the street, but that applies more to children and younger women, whereas older women are probably more likely to be in sort of areas where Israelis conduct operations to a similar degree, and the data maps quite well for the above the age of 35. So using that demographic profile, you get plug it into the analysis, and you get a range of 19%, and that's what I use in my abstract is sort of what my guess would be of an appropriate midpoint, an appropriate determination of what Palestinian fatalities should sort of be seen to be. Conclusions. Wow, actually it did finish in 20 minutes. I apologize, because that probably, you didn't hear the first half of it. The methodological flaws in Bethlelem's determination of those Palestinians who took part in the fighting and the mortality data strongly indicate that the high percentage of Palestinian fatalities classified as civilians appears to be greatly exaggerated. Instead, a demographic analysis indicates that the civilians make up probably between 7 and 50% of Palestinian fatalities, with a likely midpoint in the high teens approaching 20. It appears that there is an incredibly high degree of obfuscation, the involvement of Palestinians as combatants. As such, there should be a considerably greater degree of skepticism towards the claims of Palestinian civilian deaths. Despite the enduring numerous terror attacks and the resulting fatalities, it appears that Israel's response has been judicious, and that Palestinian civilian fatalities actually approximate the same degree of Israeli civilian fatalities. Further, the typical automatic assumption that children are non-combatants appears to be quite mistaken. Not only are they child combatants, but they seem to make up the overwhelming majority of Palestinian child fatalities. Bethlehem attempts to mitigate their methodological flaws by engaging in a sort of orientalization of Palestinian society, reflected both in their claim of there being no female civilian bystanders or targeted killings, and the removal of any sort of agency from Palestinians, particularly children. Simply put, Bethlehem's analysis is based upon extremely flawed assumptions, with no significant effort done to mitigate them. Finally, Bethlehem's actions have the effect of undermining their own stated goals. That is, the possibility of forming a base for better understanding and reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians, as Bethlehem's reporting massively distorts Israel's actions and promotes the image of Israel simply as a butcher of women and children. And I don't say that lightly. For example, in their 2007 report, the most recent report I could get my hands on, all the images of casualties in the report are of women and children. And so despite the fact that those make up the smallest proportion of fatalities, it is what features prominently in their literature. Thank you.
תתחת לציבור, אני אטפל בזה. Okay. Okay. Okay, let's do it.
All on the bar. On the bar side.
I see. Okay. Meantime, thank you very much. The last presentation reminded me of a story that somebody told me the name of President Reagan, that he once said about this young preacher who came to the West for his first job, and he prepared for Sunday 2 hours presentation. And Sunday, the church, only one cowboy shows up. And he wants to cancel it. And he says doesn't want to give his speech. So he said to the cowboy, I said to him, do you want me to give, what would you suggest to do? And he said, listen, I don't know, I'm a cowboy. I fill up my track with hay, and I go to give my cows to eat. And even if one cow shows up, I still have to feed them. So he understood the message, and he said, okay. Gave him a 2-hour presentation. After the 2 hours, he asked the cowboy, tell me, how was it? He said, listen, I'm a simple cowboy. I know when this cow shows up, I give him to eat, but I don't force him to eat my whole truck. It was really excellent, and I hope everybody, I'm sure there's a lot to learn from it. I'm not surprised that B'Tselem didn't like it. And also the Journal of Peace Research has its own agenda. I mean, although I published there, it still comes out from Oslo. So I understand that this is not the most objective place, and it's really stupid to send such a thing to B'Tselem to be the referee. However, okay, we have 10 minutes for questions and answers. Please, let's do it. Everybody, just keep it to questions. I know it's loaded. There's a lot of people here who have what to say, but there's more questions and answers. And please, we'll collect a few questions. Yes, please.
Thank you. Professor Nzelibe, what you present is an interesting case of moral hazard. It's very similar to Prof, like you said. If you compensate the minority, then it externalizes the majority. So I suggest you look at anti-influence, the article by Robert Kutter, which offers a solution to this problem. For instance, if you sell a car, if there is liability to the car owner, the person who buys the car will abuse it. And if there's no liability, the person who sells the car will sell not a perfect car. So what you can suggest in the international level is a similar solution. What you can do is, instead of compensating the minority, make them pay to a third party, like to the humanitarian aid. Or, for instance, use criminal procedure, which is a very similar to anti-insurance, because it hurts one party without benefiting the other. Or, like in the last judgment, one of the last judgments of the ICJ against Yugoslavia, they gave a declaratory judgment that there was genocide, there was certain crimes without giving any compensation. So, all these measures, unless there's a certain zero-sum game between the two rivals, will help you to solve this moral hazard problem.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. All very interesting presentations. 3 quick questions for, I think I'm sparing one person. Oh, Anne is sparing. But just the first one for Birenbaum. I do think you have to be very careful about the predominance of men on the street and in the definition of non-combatants. It may well be that young men, young boys, much more girls are inclined to take part in public activities of the type in which Israeli force might be used as a response. But if the claim is that firing, say, on a group of young men, one of whom has thrown a rock, is indiscriminate, you're not going to find females there. So I think it's a much more profound challenge to your demography than you may suppose, even for older females. They're home looking after the grandbabies. But I do suppose that Bethlehem may well take advantage of the peculiar ICRC interpretation, which says that if you're an ununiformed combatant, you're a combatant only at the time you're actually engaging in the physical activity, when you're being an orthodox. You suddenly revert to civilian. So I take the point that they may be making use of that facetious definition. On Robbie's interesting paper, be careful of the European Court of Human Rights. I'll just tell you, latest news from the British, as you're well aware, their view in Afghanistan is the European Convention applies on the Afghan battlefield. Therefore, they embed Americans to take their captures. I'm told that one of the British concerns about responding to piracy in the Gulf of Aden is, again, what the hell will they do with them if they capture them? They might have non-refoulement problems. How will they try them? So they don't do captures anymore because of the European Convention. Also, the Mahdi case, which just came down, you can't face smart sanctions, even, say, in the Bosnian War, or certainly in anti-terrorism, on any factual predicate that's classified, unless you're willing to share that factual predicate with the person disadvantaged by the sanctions. All of it has a certain logic, but you end up blaming any ability to respond. So beware of what you wish for. And then finally for Mr. Nzelibe's interesting paper, which I first became acquainted with away from Cooperman's politically incorrect response to issues of genocide in Rwanda. Just a couple, some small, some profound. R2P is being walked back at the moment, by the way. Take a look at Ed Luck's latest peregrinations on behalf of the Secretary General. Don't mean what it used to mean, so it's already a passive doctrine. Secondly, what you're saying about, I take what you're saying about temptations, but it's not true in Rwanda, it's not true in Serbia, that in Bosnia, that the third party intervention helped achieve strategic success. I mean, I'm a virulent critic of the Rwanda Tribunal for failing and refusing to try any Tutsi, and of America for supporting that view. But the Tutsi got their victory all on their own, and in Bosnia, as the old joke goes by my old friend Birenbaum, the U.S. policy was to bond the Serbs into accepting the achievement of their own war aims. The Serbs won in Bosnia. They got what they wanted. So I'm not sure those examples really support you very well. And finally, just on the defensive provocation idea. Distinguished use in bello, use ad bellum. the fact that there's been atrocities on one side does not, in modern law of reprisal generally, justify atrocities on the other side. Therefore, I think your idea of tit for tat is not going to be one that works very well.
I just would like the people to identify themselves so the people can answer them. Again, what's your name? Okay, please write it down. And your name? Shai Dutan. Okay, anybody else? Yes, please identify yourself and to whom the question is directed.
Just for the sake of knowledge, does the UN use any method or definition of indiscriminating killing of civilians, but based on statistics, not just
We don't hear you. Can you raise your voice?
based on what we've seen, the reports of the last doctor, I don't forget, I don't know what his name is, but on the
אפשר להגיד
percentage of...
בעברית ואז לתרגם אם אתה רוצה. אם זה מעדיף, אתה יכול לדבר בעברית, והיושב ראש יכול לתרגם.
הדוח שראינו ש-94% הם גברים ו6% הם נשים. האם לאום יש איזושהי הגדרה שהיא מבוססת על סטטיסטיקה של הרג מכוון ומפלה של אזרחים? זאת אומרת, האם הוא מבחין בצורה הזאת או שפשוט...
Okay, the question is, according to your, I understand it to the last, to Mr. Birenbaum, right? The question is directed to Mr. Birenbaum. Okay, and the question is exactly again, what is it? Is there a law, right, that defines the distinction between men and women?
No,
Mm-hmm.
it defines this indiscriminate killing of civilians based on statistics.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, Dr. Cohen.
My question is to Dr. Sabel.
Oh yeah, excuse me. What's your name? Sorry. מה השם שלך? אביחי. אביחי. No, what's the previous? Dubi. Okay. Dr. Cohen.
My question is to Dr. Sabel. And you started your lecture by saying that there is an assumption or there is a saying that human rights treaties are redundant. Right? Democracies don't need them and totalitarian regimes don't use them. And perhaps you'd like to clarify. At the end of your lecture, do you agree or do you disagree with this?
Okay.
At least he's paying attention.
Last question, yes.
Avichai Albitman. My question is for Professor Bayefsky. After what you said about the Arab or Muslim bloc in the United Nations, I believe because the definition of genocide, for instance, you talked about the definition of terrorism, the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention is not satisfactory, as we saw. And it was not satisfactory because of some blocks in the United Nations which prevented a satisfactory definition. So if we have a block here which can make some problems defining terrorism in the future, maybe what are your suggestions? I mean, maybe the United Nations is not the organization to deal with these sorts of problems, and maybe we will have to have some smaller, maybe more effective organizations dealing with terrorism and genocide.
Okay, thank you. We have a nice group of questions. Let's go according to the same order that we...
Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you very much. That was a very helpful recommendation. The normative side of the paper, just in reference to what you said, is sort of very tentative. I mean, as long as somebody recognizes the mall has a problem and they're willing to acknowledge it, the range of policy options to deal with it can be very broad. And I think you're referring to the anti-insurance provision, right? That was a very helpful suggestion and something that I should probably discuss in the paper, which I want to thank you for. And I just want to say, thank Professor Birchwood. I think the comments were definitely very helpful. I wanted to make some clarification when I used the defense. It wasn't to take away the culpability of, or to suggest that the culpability is decreased. It's just a question of like in sanctioning I guess that's the way we sort of use defenses and murder in the criminal context, is that in terms of sanctions, the sanctions can change. If there was provocative behavior, maybe you get 10 years. If there was no provocation and genocide takes place, you get more time. It doesn't take away the culpability. I was using that not as a court model, but as a criminal claim. The other thing is just, we can dispute the factual statements. I actually feel that in Bosnia and Rwanda it's the same. My model is not driven by the fact that humanitarian intervention actually will work for the specific group. It's that the threat for humanitarian intervention was realistic enough that they could gamble on it. And I think in both Rwanda and in Bosnia, and actually Bosnia in particular, the Bosnian agents make it clear that they felt, look, we knew that our chances for prevailing were next to none. We started this rebellion, but we predicted that the Serbians were going to react very harshly. And then the question is, they predicted that they were going to react very harshly, and that was one of the reasons why we did this. I mean, that to me suggests the moral hazard problem, that they were anticipating that there was going to be reaction to the Serbs' harsh reaction, and their military ability to prevail, they didn't have much thought about. And one can make a very similar argument, which you've already suggested, that I think Cooperman tries to make, about the Rwandans in the context of the Civil War, and to the extent that the Rwandans Patriotic Front shifted tactics. The real question is, why did they shift tactics, and why did they engage in this sort of high-risk behavior at a stage in the 1990s? Why did they increase what I would call, if you want to call it, proactive, provocative behavior? And I think part of his argument there is that there is probably a more hazard thing in the background. But as I said, these are questions of facts about how you interpret these events, and there can be some disagreement.
Well, the genocide definition, I'm not sure that it's a matter of just being unsatisfactory. I mean, the United Nations has never declared the events in Sudan as being genocide. The reason for that is that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights actually, or the UN asked for a report on conditions in Sudan and whether or not they did or did not constitute genocide. And then they struck a group to do the investigation. And the executive director of the reporting group was a Palestinian Arab who obviously had a vested interest in the outcome of the report. And the report said, it's not genocide because it's not an ethnic conflict because both sides are Muslim, which of course is nothing to do with whether or not the genocide definition is satisfied because there's an Arab ethnicity on the one side and certain kind of African tribes groups on the other. So there is an ethnic dimension and it is genocide, but only the United States calls it genocide and no one else is prepared to agree with that. So it's not just the definition, it's obviously the application of the definition. But to get to your other point as to what do we do with the fact that the United Nations has become essentially the boy toy of the Organization of the Islamic Conference. The answer depends. There are a number of possibilities. There has been suggestions to have a so-called United Democratic Nations, where, like the model of the Council of Europe, there are conditions for membership, which depend on serious interest and commitment to the rule of law and certain democratic preconditions, and then have incentives for countries to want to reform, but as a way of wanting to belong. The extent of the backlash that such an idea has caused, to me, suggests that, in fact, it could be a useful reform tool. During the last American election campaign, Senator McCain specifically backed the United Democratic Nations. Senator Obama essentially did the opposite. And most of the supporters of Senator Obama, now President-elect Obama, are absolutely dead set against any diminution of the role of the United Nations, and in fact have deliberately gone out of their way to encourage a whole new, or at least a paradigm of American foreign policy being driven through the United Nations, which actually, as compared to the last couple of years of the Bush administration, wouldn't be all that different, but nevertheless, very different approach, potentially beginning with the United States running for a membership of the Human Rights Council and attendance at the Durban conference, for example, giving new credibility to the UN. So I'm afraid that, although I completely agree with you, that in the 21st century we ought to have something else going on in terms of multilateralism, or as Ruth Wakefield calls it, competitive multilateralism, to provide alternatives for democracies. We seem to be moving in exactly the opposite direction, much to the future welfare of the State of Israel in particular.
Thank you. As to Professor Wedgwood's caveat about the European Court of Human Rights, I agree with you completely. However, like most things, what is the alternative? The alternative is a politically biased UN or UN treaty bodies, or European. I'd be happier with the European context. Professor Cohen's comment about utility of international treaty. I was hoping you wouldn't notice that I left it in the air. If I had to come down, I would say I would agree with Eleanor Roosevelt. It is useful having an international standard, even though it's not a legal norm that will be enforced in non-democratic societies. However, there certainly is utility in having this as a universal standard. Thank you.
When the issue comes to female fatalities, in fact, they don't make up the question how much proportion they make up. Of course, his key criticism is an answer to the question I can't answer. But the problem is no one can really answer. No one has done any sort of analysis to figure out what sort of percentage of women are on the streets or in the areas of operations. And there's a number of days this analysis that I did that don't appear in the paper because there's certain problems with statistical validity and objectiveness. Age and sex are easy to be absolutely, more or less absolutely easy to deal with. But for example, I was looking at people who tried to look at people who died in their homes. And this is a little difficult based on the way the little brief descriptions go along, and it's not always clear whether a person died in their homes. But I was looking at the ones that were the 600 or 700 entries that were most clear about people who died in their homes. Even among those ones, 120 of them were female, or approximately 120 were female, and 440 were male. And so if women aren't dying in the streets, they're also not dying in their homes. And so the question is, where is, they're not, why are women not targeted at all? And so the fact is it seems, so even can die, the 20% rate for dying, that I positive being civilians in our homes, and that's probably because even when they're really targeting homes, they're being very idle. In the statistical analysis, I would take away that they're actually being quite targeted in their assaults. So I didn't really understand the other question. The way that I would try to answer it is the reason that I'm using women is not, there are women combatants. In the data that I was using, there were 239 non-combatants and 240. There were only 5 who were classified as combatants. And I sort of made the assumption that they are all non-combatants, and this, of course, is rather vague. But again, it goes back to the point that there is no, these characterizations are entirely subjective. And Bethleham's response sort of exemplified that. Even their own data clearly states that a significant proportion of fatalities of civilian bystander targeted killings are female, and yet they say well, none of them are. And it was that data, that was from that analysis that was most stark to me, was the fact that how perfectly my analysis matches up with that data, and that actually in many ways indicates that it's quite actually a valid analysis, and that the question of women not being on the streets is particularly overwrought because it matches up so well.
Okay, thank you very much. This was a good opening for this conference. We had a very interesting panel. And we're going to take a break now, 15 minutes, and we're going to reconvene at 11:45. Please be here on time.
Well.